Now let me first introduce our presenters, Merlin and Elizabeth, and then we'll get right to their conversation. Elizabeth Allison is Professor of Ecology and Religion at the California Institute of Integral Studies, where she founded and chairs the graduate program in Ecology, Spirituality, and Religion, and created the Religion and Ecology Summit Conference Series. She's a member of the advisory group for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology, and editorial board member for the journal Worldviews, Global Religions, Culture, and Ecology, and the secretary of the International Society for the Study of Religion, Nature, and Culture. Merlin Sheldrake is a biologist and author of Entangled Life, How Fungi Make Our Worlds, Change Our Minds, and Shape Our Futures, a New York Times and Sunday Times bestseller, and winner of the Royal Society Book Prize and the Wainwright Prize. Merlin is a research associate of the Vrije University Amsterdam and works with the Society for the Protection of Underground Networks and the Fungi Foundation. And now it is my absolute pleasure to turn it over to Merlin and Elizabeth.
Hi, Merlin. It's such a pleasure to talk with you today. I first read this book in the dark days of the pandemic back in 2020 when it first came out. And everyone here in San Francisco was baking sourdough bread. And I just realized when I reread this book that our little fungi friends were helping us through the pandemic. But as you point out in the book, there's such a variety in fungi, from some of the largest organisms to some of the smallest. So first of all, what are fungi?
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. It's great to be chatting. And thanks to anyone who's taken the time to be here today with us. Fungi are a kingdom of life. So that's as big, as broad and busy a category as animals or plants. So there's lots of ways to be a fungus. They're a kingdom of life that has not had a kingdom's worth of attention. I think that's important. And I think that's a theme that will keep running through our conversation. But what fungi are organisms that, like animals, have to find food in the world and digest it. So not like plants, which can photosynthesize. So fungi can't make their own energy from sunlight and carbon dioxide. So they have to find food in the world. They have to digest that food, but they tend not to be like animals, which locomote, can move around a lot of the time. And fungi are more like plants in the sense that they tend to grow around rather than move around. Most fungi live their lives not as mushrooms, but as mycelial networks, which are branching, fusing networks of tubular cells. So when a lot of our conversation about fungi, when we say the word fungi, what we're really talking about is a network organism, a network of tubes that's constantly remodeling itself. And that's a sort of good image to have in mind, if it's possible to have that kind of an image in mind, as we go about our conversations.
Great, thank you. And yeah, that network idea is so fascinating to me. In the subtitle of your book, you talk about how fungi make our worlds and shape our minds. And it seems throughout the book that fungi really challenge our categories. And so you're saying they're seeking out food, but they don't really move around like animals. And I feel like the common conception though is that they're more like plants because they just stay in one place. But they're in, I mean, and then you just said they're another category, another kingdom. So how do fungi sort of disrupt our categories, our standard categories that we think about?
Well, thanks for that question. I always feel that thinking about fungi makes the world look different. And one of the reasons is that they confuse many of our categories. Some of these categories are things that we use every day. We live in societies which take them for granted, which indeed are built on these categories, like individuality, autonomy, independence. We're so used to in modern post-industrial human cultures thinking about neatly bounded individuals. We have to have neatly bounded individuals in order to get a passport, in order to fill out a tax return, in order to be an identifiable citizen in society. But when you look at the living world, it becomes clear that individuality is not so much a natural fact, but more a category that depends on your point of view. Fungi make questions of individuality in so many ways. Their networks, their branching, fusing networks, these mycelial networks, you could take a fragment of a network and it could turn into an entirely new organism. It'd be a bit like taking a bit of your hair or a tiny fragment of your skin and growing a whole new you. You could then take that new fungus and introduce it to the parent fungus, or that wouldn't strictly be a parent because it's not a new generation. And those two networks would fuse with each other fine and just become a new functional individual. So this is the kind of behavior that they confuse as individuality. There are other ways. Intelligence is another one. You know, plants confuse intelligence too. I think when we really sit with and inquire into the lives of any kind of other organism, we find that this question of intelligence is confused, because the concept of intelligence is rooted in the cognitive sciences, which took the human mind, the human brain and human mind to be the center of their inquiry. And so all organisms were judged according to their relative position in human-style intelligence tests, like recognizing yourself in a mirror. But of course, there are so many ways to be alive. There are so many ways to rise to the challenge of living. All organisms are confronted with innumerable problems they have to solve, innumerable variability they have to adapt to. Fungi are no different. But they have really, I think they make this intelligence question into a really strong and pointy question. When you watch a fungus navigating a labyrinth, for example, and this is something that researchers do, you can create little microscopic labyrinths and let fungal networks grow through the labyrinth. They can find the shortest path between the entrance and the exit, a bit like slime molds can. Slime molds have become poster organisms for brainless problem solving, but fungi do this as well. And if you watch a fungus going about this labyrinth, when it's confronted with a forked path, it doesn't have to choose one or the other paths. It can branch and take both routes, and later on assess which is the more efficient route through the labyrinth. So intelligence is another category that fungi confuse for us. There are so many more, but these are two that I play with a lot.
Individuality and intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So can you give some other examples of fungal intelligence? It's such an intriguing concept and definitely expands how we think about intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And how does it change how we think about intelligence?
So some background I think it's important to mention is that this notion of intelligence is undergoing a big revision within the biological sciences from lots of points of view, from people studying animals, from people studying plants, from people studying fungi and bacteria even, and other microbes. Because this concept was severely in need of an update. And so these days, intelligence is variously defined, and these definitions can take all sorts of shapes, but they usually have in common some traits like being able to solve problems, being able to adapt to changes, being able to make decisions in the organism's way, not necessarily in the way we do, but in the organism's way, make decisions between alternative courses of action. Within these broader, these deepened and expanded definitions of intelligence, it becomes clear that actually to be alive, one has to be intelligent to some degree. And actually it's more interesting to ask, to what degree is an organism intelligent rather than is an organism intelligent? And what kinds of intelligent behavior does this organism display? So with fungi, a good place to look is to just, when we look twice at many of the things that many of the ways they live their life. So mycorrhizal fungi are a type of fungus that I like to study, and maybe we'll come on to that later. They live their life in and around plant roots in a kind of trade relationship where the plants supply the fungus with sugars and fats, so energy-containing carbon compounds. The fungus supplies the plant with minerals, mineral nutrients that it's found in the soil, like nitrogen or phosphorus. And they have a kind of trading relationship. It's a very ancient relationship. It goes back to the beginnings of macroscopic life on land. And almost all plants form relationships with these fungi. So if we think about life as one of these fungi for a moment, it could be a network that sprawls over tens of meters. It has millions, billions perhaps, of growing tips, all foraging around in the labyrinthine environment in the soil. It could be connected to multiple plants, engaged in different kinds of trading relationship with different plants, and different types of dynamics of trade with the same plant, but at different parts of the plant root system. All of this going on and at the same time. So it's trading with lots of plant partners. It's integrating information from over meters, square meters. It's every growing tip is somehow informed by every other growing tip in the network. There are intricately regulated flows moving through these networks. Substances are passing around these networks in complicated ways that we're only just beginning to observe, let alone understand. This fungus is a sensing body. It's sensitive to temperature, to any number of chemicals, to gravity, pressure, acidity, moisture, so many different kinds of senses it has. And these different senses, these sensory data streams are being funneled through the network and integrated somehow so that the fungus can assess in its way these data streams and act accordingly, informed by what's going on around it. So this is a kind of moment-to-moment challenge that a fungus would face. And this is not an unusual day for this fungus. This is just what it's doing more or less all the time. And so that's the kind of intelligent behavior that it has, the intelligence to regulate itself in the face of these innumerable variables, these innumerable biological partners, very intimate partners, and in constantly changing and heterogeneous environment.
It sounds like a very distributed intelligence throughout, yeah, and very responsive. I mean, when you describe that sort of intelligence, then I actually wonder if humans are very intelligent, because we're more bounded, and you described so many different variables that the fungus is responding to all the time. But I want to go back to something that you said initially. You said intelligence is being reassessed in plants and animals, and you said even in bacteria. So are you suggesting intelligence is everywhere throughout life?
I have a lot of time for the view that intelligence is a fundamental feature of life, that to be alive, one has to have some degree of intelligence. It might be one sort of intelligence, not another sort of intelligence that manifests in different kinds of intelligent behaviors. But and some might be much more sophisticated intelligent behaviors than others. But if we think, I like thinking about intelligence as decision making, as problem solving, as adapting, and all organisms to some degree do this. So yes, I would say, in my view, that some degree of intelligence is required to be a living organism.
Which does really sort of challenge the hierarchy of humanity as a sort of apex of life.
Yeah, I mean, we're locked in this kind of species narcissism that we've inherited, and it's come cascading down the generations for quite a long time. And I think it's really about time that we loosened the grip of that story. I mean, it's just so much more fun to live in a world where we're not the smartest and the best. I don't really want to live in that story. I have so much fun when I step out of that story, and it's like a sort of cold, clammy pair of like swimming shorts. I don't really want to get back into it. It's yeah, happy to leave it behind.
I definitely
not only
got
because
this.
it's not just more fun, so it's also hugely dangerous. So I think we benefit in many ways by moving beyond that, by evolving.
I definitely got the sense that fungi are running the world, perhaps more than we are. And you sort of, as you said, sort of subvert the dominant paradigm, try to take a fungal view here. But is that your sense? Are fungi sort of more in charge? I mean, so we should talk about mycorrhizal fungi, because you just mentioned them, and they're everywhere under our feet, right? Do you want to explain what they are and how they contribute to forests and plants?
For sure, yeah. So about 500 million years ago, when plants were, the ancestors of plants were freshwater algae, so kind of puddles of photosynthetic tissue floating in the nutrient soup in rivers and lakes. And they were making their energy from sunlight and carbon dioxide. They were absorbing nutrients from the nutrient soup that they're floating in. And when they started to wash up on these soggy shores, they faced all sorts of new challenges. And foremost among those challenges was, how do they acquire the nutrients they need from this complex labyrinthine soil type substrate? And they're not great rangers in this kind of wilderness. They're used to soaking in a nutrient soup. Fungi are great rangers in this kind of complex microenvironment. So it seems that at this very earliest moment of life on land for plants, they struck up a relationship with fungi, and these fungi behaved as their root systems, allowing them to reach down through the fungus, a kind of prosthesis, a living prosthesis, into the complex environment of the soil, acquiring water, acquiring nutrients, and developing a kind of trading relationship. So this seems to be, certainly plants had fungal relationships for tens of millions of years before they evolved roots. So these fungal relationships are a more fundamental part of planthood than roots, than wood, than leaves, fruit, flowers, so many things that we think of as characteristically planty. So fast forward to now, and almost all plants still depend on these fungi that live in and around their roots and do a similar kind of thing. There are also fungi that live in plant tissues, in the leaves, in the stem. Plant life is inseparable from fungal life. In fact, when you look at a plant, what you're looking at is the outcome of a braided history of association. It's what you see is an alga that has evolved to farm fungi, and fungi that have evolved to farm algae. And you're seeing that all in this body that we call a plant. And I mean, this, for me, this is really profound. It changes. It's a kind of parable about how evolution works. Evolution is always evolution with, evolution by association. Symbiosis is a non-negligible, a non-negotiable feature of life. And so yes, so the life around us, the life that sustains us, is part fungus, and these relationships have changed changed climate in the past. They've caused global cooling. They've created geological layers. They've done so many things which under the big grand sweep of eons. So we're just a tiny flash in the pan here. So if we want to think about like human life in relation to fungal life, then it's kind of incomparable. You know, we've been around for such a short time. Fungi have been around, busily evolving for over 1 billion years. So whether they run the show, I mean, they have a huge influence on the show. I'd say that they're pretty important producers in the show, frequently directors, maybe sometimes casting agents and actors and chorus members, audience as well. But obviously it takes all sorts to make a biosphere. So I wouldn't want to say that they were the ones in charge, although I often talk like that because I'm really into them.
Their prevalence, as you make very clear in the book, just it does suggest that they're well, and you just spoke about how they're knitting things together, how they're weaving together, even plants, like weaving into the ground, basically the first roots of plants. So we can't really think about plants without fungi, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And yet it seems like there's so many threads I want to follow, like a fungal network, I suppose. And yet you talk about how there's departments of botany and there's departments of zoology, but there aren't that many departments of mycology. Why is that if they're so important to life?
So this really is an on-running theme through any conversation about fungi. You know, you run into the mystery pretty fast. You're 2 steps away from, oh, we don't know. Fungi are understudied, they're underrepresented in academic courses, they're barely represented in most school curricula. There are a few reasons for this. One is that there is a taxonomic reason. They were only delimited as a separate kingdom of life in the late 60s. So it's only in the late 60s that they won their independence. That meant that before this, fungi were thought of as a kind of lower plant. And they were studied in unglamorous corners of botany departments. And so there's a kind of disciplinary bias that's entrenched because of this. There just hasn't been, the same amount of professorships or any kind of students or research funds or any of the things that create modern scientific knowledge. And part of this is because they're weird. They do things so differently, so strangely. They live most of their lives out of the reach of our immediate senses. They're embedded within whatever they're eating. They're hard to access. And so a lot of the ways that this has changed, that our thinking about fungi has changed, has been through technological advances and new analytical techniques that grant us access to fungal lives in ways that we didn't have access before. And so this is something that's developing over time, still very fast moving. And so part of the reason is taxonomic, part of the reason is technological, that we simply know more than we did. And I think there are lots of reasons why we're seeing a kind of surge of interest in fungi right now. This is a moment of ecological crisis, and fungi are kind of ecological poster organisms. They embody the basic principle of ecology. They form connections between organisms. They're a kind of embodied relationship. And they really, I think, speak to this moment that we find ourselves in. But and they're also networks. We live in a kind of there's a network zeitgeist, kind of big time. And since the web really kicked off in the late 90s, and network thinking has permeated many aspects of human inquiry, network models, network thinking. You'd find it in so many different branches of academic discourse, for example. And so fungi, again, are kind of poster organisms for network thinking. And so we're seeing that change starting to happen now as people catch on to that. So there are reasons for the surge of interest now. There are reasons why they've been historically neglected. And I think one of the reasons why it's so fascinating to be studying them now, talking about them now, is because we have so many open questions. There are wide open questions wherever you look. And so I find a sense of excitement when I'm confronted with open questions, and whenever I talk to people about these things, they tend to find a sense of excitement when confronted with the open questions. So there's also a blessing, I think, to the fact that we know relatively little about fungi, is that we get to experience this time of wild, proliferating inquiry into the mystery.
Absolutely. It's stunning to me that it was only in the 60s that they were recognized as their own kingdom. I mean, I didn't know, but to think that recently there was that much that we didn't know about fungi, like that we didn't know they weren't plants. It is quite amazing. And it makes me think of, these repeated claims of the end of history or the end of exploration. We've discovered everything there is to discover. And yet there's this whole world that's going on at the same time right now as us that you're saying we know very little about. And that is incredibly exciting. And yeah, I think how thrilling to be in a field with so many open questions as far as even, I don't know, how do these things live, or what are some of the open questions right now that are interesting to you?
I'm working with a wonderful team in Amsterdam, and we are trying to understand just the basics of information transfer within mycorrhizal fungal networks. How do they stay in touch with themselves? How do they process information? How do they integrate different data streams? And so we have this amazing setup where we can look inside the fungal cells, inside these tubular cells, and watch the flows moving around in these networks, and watch in real time. You see a kind of it's not like just a river that's flowing always in one direction, or like a river of traffic in these time lapses of Manhattan, you see. But you can have a sort of a flow that's changing speed, and it comes to a junction, and then it goes up it goes up to the right side of the junction, and then it comes back and it goes up to the left side, and then the whole thing changes direction again, and then speeds up, and then a bit branches off here, and it's completely unpredictable, and with powerful non-random patterns that we're starting to piece together, and it's really basic. It's like, how do they communicate to the different parts of themselves that there's lots of nutrients here rather than over here where there's fewer nutrients? How does that feed into their behavior with regard to their plant partner? We're looking at radically simplified systems here in the lab, but still these the basic dynamics of fungal communication eludes us. So this is really exciting. Really looking at fungal behavior and thinking of them as organisms that are behaving. But the really big mysteries are, what are they doing outside in the bustling world, the wet, wild world, say in a tropical forest or any number of forests, or in just an old growth grassland, or in a city park. At any one moment, what is happening in just one of the fungi, one of the many fungi that will be living there? How is it interacting with the other fungi? How is it managing itself? We can't just look through the layers of soil into a fungal network in the field and see what it's doing. We have to use quite clumsy experimental approaches. You can measure transfers by using labeled chemicals that end up more here or more there, and those are powerful techniques. And there are various genetic techniques using DNA and RNA, but it's so hard to access. So what fungi are actually doing outside in the world at any one moment, we know very little about. We can do very, very elegant, extraordinarily skillful experiments in labs and greenhouses, and there are incredible fungal researchers doing this all the time. It's a very amazing community of dedicated, passionate, wise, and startlingly brilliant people doing this work. But it's still very difficult to extrapolate from a lab experiment to the bustling world out there. It's a problem that many biologists face in any discipline. But so these very basic questions. There are other questions about, there are so many things we don't know about their metabolisms. How do they ever see the chemical transformations that they ever see? What is it how do they develop enzymes that are able to accomplish certain chemical reactions at certain places in certain times? Why do some fungi do that and not others? The nature of fungal evolution, how these organisms have evolved, how they've evolved with other organisms, how certain abilities have ended up in some fungal lineages and not others. These are all lots of big questions there as well. And there's all the ways that we can partner with fungi, to adapt to life on a damaged planet. So there's all sorts of questions about how can we work with them? How are there ways that we can try and move around some of our pressing problems by involving fungi in our lives somehow?
Right. Yeah. In grad school, I shared an office with a grad student who was trying to develop some forms of myco-remediation for oil spills. I don't know how far that moved forward, but it does seem like there's some potential, right? That like fungi will eat lots of different things, right? And will they, but can we really call on them to save us, or should we save ourselves?
I mean, the saving narrative, I don't know how helpful it is to know this sort of salvation narrative. I mean, I can see why we think that way. It's deeply embedded in lots of the major myth structures that have brought us to this moment. But I certainly think that we can look at how organisms evolve over time, and in times of crisis, symbiotic relationships evolve. The symbiosis is not an option. We're always living with, evolving with, being with, and in many of the great turbulent moments, or in some of the toughest liminal zones, the most remarkable associations have arisen and have stuck together. Then Margulis, the great biologist of symbiosis, describes the long-lasting intimacy of strangers, relationships that form in times of crisis, or to solve certain pressing problems, enable new possibilities, and then remain. So this is a time of crisis. And are there ways that we can form new types of relationship within human cultures too? Like, so different cultures, different academic disciplines, if one's an academic, different age groups, just how can we come together in new ways, interdisciplinarity being a superpower, to form new kinds of structures and organizations and ways of being together that help us adapt to creatively to these challenges. And how can we do that with other organisms? And I think fungi form part of that story. So I wouldn't say that there are saviors. There are so many problems that fungi cause for us. There are endless problems they cause. There are fungal diseases, rising incidence of fungal diseases. We're creating conditions for the fungal evolution, new evolution of fungal pests. And fungi will, there's any number of problems that they'll cause for us. And these have been much discussed. So they're definitely not our saviors. But I think there are many ways that we can partner with fungi to solve problems. And I think it's actually hard to imagine a future. I mean, fungi have been so much part of our lives and cultures and societies for such an unknowably long time. We live in a fungal world, and whether or not we think about it. So our future, it will be at least as fungal as the past. And perhaps we can make it a little more consciously fungal, and deal with some of our problems.
It does seem like, I appreciate your caution around the salvation narrative, because certainly there's a lot of caveats there. It does seem like this recent knowledge and exploration of fungi and awareness, and then, as you said, the technological advancements that allow us to study them more carefully and closely. It does seem like maybe it's opening up new ways of thinking about the world and new ways of being in the world. So you talked about the network metaphor, which is so prevalent now, of course, in this internet age. And you talked about fungi being like the sort of original networkers or web. And so I was thinking about whether which way the metaphor goes. Is it a technological metaphor that we're applying to fungal networks, or is it an organic metaphor from the fungi that we're then applying to our technology? So I'm curious about your thoughts on that. But in either case, it seems to the network metaphor or web metaphor seems to give us new ways of thinking about, back to the beginning, about individuality, autonomy, interconnection, responsibility, and so on, which could be helpful in this time. What do you think?
Yeah. So which way does the arrow go in the metaphor? It's such a tangle, isn't it? I think it often goes both ways at once. And certainly, I mean, you talk to many cosmologists now, and the way that the whole universe is conceived is as a cosmic web. The huge filaments of gas and galaxies joining galactic super clusters in a kind of vast network at the largest possible scale. So it's not just fungi that do networks. Networks seem to be a feature of the reality that we inhabit. And but yeah, I mean, sometimes in specific instances, you can totally see a computer metaphor that's been applied to fungi. Like Wood Wide Web is a classic case of. It's a helpful metaphor. It makes vivid the idea of plants and fungi living in shared networks. I use this term, and I think it can be. It's vivid. It opens our eyes to a kind of relationship that we might not otherwise have thought of, a kind of social networking. But at the same time, it's ultimately a machine metaphor, and it is a metaphor that usually makes fungi the kind of passive cables joining up trees. It renders fungi quite passive, and I think that's very far from the truth, because fungi are busily, actively engaged in their lives. They're far from passive cables linking up rooted. So anyway, that's one case where you can see a computer metaphor applied to fungal life. There are lots of aspects of network behavior that seem to be more organic than mechanistic. Networks can grow in interesting ways. There are kind of different ways of thinking about networks and analyzing them, which reveal them to be a kind of, to have organic emergent, organic-like emergent properties that we see in non-human organizations. So I don't think there's always a sort of sharp distinction between human and non-human, but no, it's important to think about that. It's important to think about that when we make sense of symbiotic relationships, because the whole history of the study of symbiotic relationships has been fraught with metaphors, from the very since 1869 or so, when lichens were being studied and thought of as symbiotic organisms formed from the close relationship of fungi and algae, and the relationship between masters and slaves, men and women, the relationships between nations, all sorts of human societal metaphors were applied to these intimate relationships. And then those relationships were used to naturalize, so to different kinds of human behavior. So, we live in a industrial capitalist society, unmitigated conflicts and competition. This is a natural state of affairs. Look at these organisms over here doing their unmitigated conflict and competition. Or we live in a mutual aid, societies of sharing, of a socialist structure. Look over there. Look at these examples of animals doing mutual aid. So it's such a convoluted process, and actually a really fascinating one. It's one of the reasons why the history of the science of symbiosis is so juicy, because it's a sort of a prism through which our societal values is dispersed, and we enter a kind of hall of mirrors and see that in all sorts of different directions. So that's a convoluted way to think about this question of which way the arrow points. And I've actually forgotten what the next part of the question was.
Well, I'll just keep threading along. I really appreciate that point that our social metaphors then shape what we observe in the world around us, right? And how we interpret it as much as for understanding human social life. And I think that idea is often overlooked, right? It's sort of the naturalistic fallacy is like, oh, we see something in nature, therefore, it must be the case, sort of forgetting about the interpretive lens that human society puts on it to describe what the relationship is. And when we were thinking about this idea of networks and interconnecting threads all throughout the cosmos, it occurred to me also that even in the human body, like the fascia is the understudied connective tissue of the human body that I think also wasn't really known about until recent decades. And so at a lot of different levels, we're starting to perceive this connective tissue that really was ignored for so many centuries of human scientific study. And maybe it provides new metaphors. So I think what was a question that was arising is what kind of new metaphors might you be discovering in your relationships with fungi? I'm not even going to say your study of, but more of like a partnership with fungi. Like what new metaphors might they be suggesting to you?
Well, one of the problems I have with sort of conventional ways of representing networks is that we tend to think of them a bit like how you'd sketch them on a piece of paper as entities are joined with a line or a dotted line sometimes, but the idea that they're self-standing entities that can be joined with a dotted line, and it feels like the kind of thing we do in a recovery mode from years of reductive experimental science, where we sort of cut the world into little pieces, and now we're trying to string it back together again because we're so drowning in detail and have lost sight of the big picture. And so let's just connect these different pieces together with a line connecting the different parts, the different components that have been separated somehow. But really, these relationships it's less like two entities joined with a line. It's more like there's a picture by Escher with drawing hands, with one hand drawing the other hand, which is drawing the other hand at the same time. It's a more co-creative process. There's a kind of shimmering relational field that sustains and indeed is sort of almost ontologically prior to the existence of these entities in the first place. And I think that's a very profound shift in perspective. And so I try to think as much as I can in that mode of relationship not being something we stir in afterwards to help us recover from a reductive mindset, but something which is absolutely fundamental, that gives rise to the very things we think of as entities in the first place. So a metaphor that I find really helpful for that I find in the fungal world, is that of lichens. Lichens, these symbiotic organisms, what you see, the body of the lichen that you see is emergent from any number of relationships between fungi, algae, bacteria. There are more types of relationship within lichens being uncovered by the month, more or less. But what you see is a form, often complex form, often very wild chemistry going on inside lichens, crazy colors, abilities to live in extreme environments, crazy abilities to digest certain compounds like or substances like rock. They devour rock, many lichens do. But the individual partners, if you want to break the organism down into its parts, they're members of this lichen. They don't form structures anything like what you see the lichen forming. So it's a bit like the elements of hydrogen and oxygen coming together to make water, like two flammable gases creating water. And it's totally sort of unexpected from first principles. And likewise in lichens, what you see is this sort of wild product of relationship, a kind of non-linear explosion that happens out of these relationships. So the concept of a lichen, I find an enormously fertile metaphor for thinking about human relationships, for thinking about relationships we form with other organisms, for thinking about clusters of ideas. Any time that I try to think about networks in this more co-constitutive way, lichens it's a metaphor that I reach for. There are others too, but that's one.
That's so great. So I have a friend who studied lichens in grad school, and this is just a small joke. So she and I went to an event, and she met someone new, and he said, "What do you do?" And she said, "I'm a lichenologist." And he said, "That's cool, but what do you do?" And she said, "I'm a lichenologist." And he was like, "But what do you study?" And she said, "I'm a lichenologist." He thought she was saying, "I'm like an ologist." And he thought it was too much California talk, like I'm like an ologist.
Yeah.
Anyway, I had to drop that in. I just love this phrase that you said, the shimmering ontological field, and of this co-creative capacity of fungi. And it made me think of some indigenous concepts actually that I've read about, like Deborah Bird Rose has an essay called The Shimmer, where she talks about in Aboriginal Australian culture, there's this idea that when things are really alive, they have a shimmer to them, and it can also get dimmed if, for various negative things happen to that livingness. And so I wonder if there's a parallel there, if you've observed the shimmer in your field studies, or what more you have to say about that.
Yes, well, I certainly think that many of these concepts that we're discussing are, in the modern sciences, they're often talked about as discoveries. But I think it's more remembering. I think these are things, these are ideas. The idea of that we live in an intimate, reciprocal web of relations, and this is, I think, something that humans have known for a very long time in different parts of the world and different traditional knowledge systems, and that it's in some sense modern biology is catching up, or at least unforgetting. So yes, I think that's a key point. That this isn't. Much of this isn't really new in principle. There are new stories, there are new findings about certain organisms and the way they relate. But I think the bigger picture that it's revealing is not a new understanding, but a welcome remembering of a very ancient understanding. But yeah, the shimmer is I mean, so I think about, so there's fields of relation, you know, if I think about it as a field, because it's hard to picture. We're so used to thinking in terms of individuals. It's hard to think about how these individuals, what their relationship actually looks like. But of course, their relationship looks like both of, if you're looking at two partners, looks like both of them. And if you think about time, if you think about these organisms as living on the sort of growing front of the present moment, but with evolutionary histories stretching in like roots, tangling deep into the past. And if you think about the roots of these two entities, these two humans, it could be to a human and a dog, or a human and a cat. You think about the roots of these entities stretching back through past, tangling around each other, you know, in this big braided kind of stream of togetherness. And so what you're seeing is just the growing tip of a relationship, and so so I like to think about organisms as processes like that rather than things. And when I think about organisms as processes, you know, when we were processes, the stuff that makes up your body is not the same stuff that made up your body a few years ago. So we're kind of fields of stability through which matter is passing. And when you take this processual view, there are lots of helpful metaphors. Music is a helpful metaphor because music is inherently a process. You can't have a snapshot of music at an instant. It's inconceivable. But there are other good metaphors of process, like wave patterns, flow patterns, and standing wave patterns. And these are shimmering patterns. These patterns actually shimmer. You know, I spent some time studying Faraday wave patterns where you vibrate liquids, and you look at the standing wave patterns that arise, complex forms that arise through the interference of regular repeating oscillating waves. And these are shimmering patterns. You know, these absolutely shimmer. And so I like this metaphor of the shimmering because I'm led into these very fundamental processes that can inform the way that we make sense of processes in biology.
Fantastic. And these metaphors and these understandings seem to be very challenging to modern industrial society. I'm wondering, like, how the implications are liberatory, but they're also, I would say, threatening to the status quo. Liberatory in that they could lead us into perhaps a more collective, collaborative, compassionate future. But I feel like also the status quo is doesn't want to be disturbed. So I'm curious, when you talk about the implications, like whether you get any kind of pushback from the status quo in terms of like these ideas that break down the autonomous individual could be threatening to capitalism, for example, and property. So for these wider implications, what sort of responses are you getting?
I've had no one, I mean, most people tend to be quite interested in this way of thinking. And there's plenty of people talking about this at the moment. And I'm just coming at it from a fungal point of view, but it's, I think being invited to question these categories that we might not think about, but which turns out organize so many of our behaviors, I think that's quite a compelling activity. But not necessarily that it would change the way you want things to be, or change the way that you go about your life afterwards. You might just take a little trip, a little holiday into kind of a web of intimate reciprocal dependence, and then step back into a hyper-individualist mode. In fact, it's very hard not to do that when we're living in the societies that we're living in, because at some point I do have to produce my passport or produce my driving license, and once again, my individuality is reified, and also there are certain ways that this concept is persistent. Like, it does feel to me like I behave as, as in some way a relevant unit of biological organization. That there is some relevance to the meanness of me. So I wouldn't want to blow that all away either. But I think these ideas can be really threatening and destabilizing, because if you live in a capitalist system, and capitalism depends on individuals acting in rationally, And if there aren't really individuals anymore, then everything comes crashing down. So yeah, I think these ideas are very powerful. I think they can helpfully erode many of the decaying structures that we live within that aren't fit for purpose. I think they don't necessarily lead us to a better, more generative, happy place. They could also lead us to all sorts of problematic places as well. But I think there are also just recurring themes. You know, you don't need biologists to sort of preach about this stuff to feel like this is the case. I think, you know, this is something that these ways of being and knowing and understanding are something that we often experience intuitively in our lives, in the stories that we hear from the past, and the ways we imagine, the ways that our minds work, and the way that we like the arts, and the way that we create and play, and form loving relationships, the way that we are affected by emotions, all these ways. So yes, so I think these are powerful ideas. I think they could lead us towards positive change, but not necessarily.
Sure. And earlier you gave the caveat that we shouldn't think of fungi as our saviors or something. It seems like they're more multivocal than that. They're maybe more like a trickster, or yeah, or even, again, a metaphor that we don't really have yet. I just love the shimmer. I'm going to be thinking about that a lot more. And yeah, and maybe fungi are providing some new metaphors to think about. And just now, and in your book, you've talked a lot about how they potentially break down these boundaries around the individual. And then you said, but you were sort of reified as an individual as well. But I was thinking, also, you're like surrounded by so many creative, super creative, innovative thinkers in your life, like your dad, Terence McKenna, Paul Stamets, David Abram. And so I'm wondering how they have also sort of, well, influenced you, if so, and but also sort of extended the boundaries of who Merlin is.
They've had a huge role to play in extending the boundaries of who I am, as have you know, anyone that I've ever felt close to, you know, and you know, I think we're all so affected by the beings that we live around. It might be a pet that we have, you know, we might feel like this, our cat or our dog or our tortoise can somehow give us a new mind to explore the world, give us new perspectives, help us to step out of our frames of reference and explore new possibilities. And so yeah, so these people you mentioned have all been influential, and but I almost feel uncomfortable singling them out, because, you know, all of those that I love and respect have shaped me, and I feel like it's just a part of being a human, you know, that we are porous, and that we always thinking with and imagining with. But yes, I feel very blessed to have known these folks, and the many others who have taught me, and who have played with me, and who have challenged me, and invited me into new places.
Great point about how it's not, as you said earlier, it's not like a point-to-point line in a network, but it's actually all part of the network, or yeah. So that we're not only imagining nodes in the network, but all the filaments influencing and connecting. That's such a nice way to think about it. So I know that we're nearly to the end of our scheduled discussion time. Is there something that I should have asked you that I didn't yet?
I've been having a great time. I can't think of anything that you should have asked me.
Excellent. Okay, so I think that we have like a whole bunch of questions. Oh, here's one other thing that I did want to ask you. You write about being sort of a speculative biologist, and I was super interested in that idea, connecting a more sort of philosophical approach with like lots of field work and lots of lab work. And I wondered what sort of reception that has among biologists. I mean, certainly your work and your book has such broader implications. But I know that sometimes scientists don't want to push the speculation too far. So I'm just curious about that response.
You know, it really depends what activity I'm engaged in. If I'm writing a book for a general audience, then part of that process is going to be letting people into a more personal position, a more personal mode, and that's filled with speculation. We all speculate, we all imagine, we all wonder. And so if I'm sitting around at night with my scientist friends and we're having some wild conversation filled with speculations, then we'd all be speculating wildly, and that's so much fun. If I am writing a paper talking about an inquiry that has been made involving certain sets of data in certain ways, then there might be some speculation there, but it might be quite clearly marked as this is speculative, this is not what the data says, but we're thinking forwards in time, because there's a kind of responsibility in that mode to be clear about what you're drawing from the evidence and what you're imagining as a future possibility. So for me, it just depends on the context. But I don't think speculation is an option. It's not, imagination is not an option. Like, we all are imaginative, speculative beings. It's just, it's so fundamental to our conscious minds. I think it's more about how we relate to that. So when in the book, I gently, I tease some of the scientific structures that marginalizes speculation as if it's something that shouldn't happen here. We might do it at night, but it's not going to feature in our papers. But it's quite a funny opera to think of people sort of separating part of themselves and putting forward a non-speculative, strict part of themselves in another place. But it's also a misconception that people who aren't practicing scientists can have about scientists, is that they're cold-blooded, rational beings. But in fact, scientists are and have always been emotional, whole, imaginative, playful beings trying to make sense of a world that was never made to be catalogued and systematized. So I think there are different ways that it can cut, but I think it's a fun discussion to have, to return to that place of imaginative mind, of a wandering mind, and then to feel the way that unites us as humans.
Yeah, absolutely, because it's that wonder and awe that prompts the questions in the first place, right? Like, I wonder what's happening here. I wonder how this truffle came to be here, or why the dogs love them so much, or whatever. Yeah. So I really appreciate that, how you take us back to wonder. And I loved the initial vignette of trying to follow these mycorrhizal fungi with your nose and just trying to follow them through the forest floor. I think it really vividly puts us into the scene. Thank you. It's been so fun chatting. There are tons of questions from the audience. But yeah, I just really want to thank you for taking the time. And I know it's getting to be evening over there. But I was really stoked to chat with you today, and I really appreciate you joining us here at CIIS.
Thanks for having me. It's been wonderful to chat. Absolutely.
Great. So it says actually several members of the audience have this question. Can you talk about the ties between mycology and process theory? How can we draw from the intelligence of mycelium to inform transdisciplinary models?
Yes, good question. So I've been working with Matt Segal, actually, and we're working on a way to think about whitehead and fungi together, and it's a really fertile, exciting discussion, ongoing discussion. And so, how does mycology relate to process theory? And it's the first part. The second part, the transdisciplinary, the transdisciplinary relationship. So, I think any any aspect of biology is, we can think about that as relating to process theory, in the sense that process theory is, we take that the fundamental unit of existence is a process rather than some kind of fixed thing, some enduring substance. So a process view rather than a substance view. But all life forms are so evidently processes when you take a moment to look at them, that I think life, like music, returns us to a process view. I think fungi can do this in particularly interesting ways, because fungal networks, because these fungal cells, these tubular cells, they elongate, they grow by getting longer. So in our bodies, lots of types of tissue will divide, the cells will divide and pile layers of cells on top of layers of cells, like a liver, for example. But fungal cells, they grow by getting longer, they prolong themselves. And so when you see a fungal network, you're looking, and so the growing tip is the part of the fungus that is growing. It's the part of the fungus that divides or confused with other bits of the network. It's the part of it's like the decision-making unit, a decision-making unit of a fungal network. So when you look at a fungal network, what you're seeing is a kind of cartographical representation in space of a history of past decisions made by growing tips. It's a bit like trees. Trees are like this too, because plants, they grow from their tips. So many trees are kind of portraits of time. Fungal networks, again, are a kind of portrait of time. And so for this reason, I think they're very helpful when taking a processual view. I think they form a really good kind of poster kingdom of organisms for thinking about process and the way that and leading us into a more processual mindset. So the transdisciplinary associations, yeah, I think fungi can provide really great, because they form so many wild relationships with organisms much bigger than them, with organisms much smaller than them, relationships that stretch and braid through time. I think they form really good models for thinking about the ways of relating in any way, let alone within human disciplines. So yes, I think if we want to think about relating, the artistry of relation and the generative potential of relation, the unexpected non-linear outcome of relation, fungi are hugely important, and I think about them in relation to human disciplines all the time.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I think earlier you said something like transdisciplinary thinking is a superpower or something like that. So yeah, and fungi is a great model for that. Very cool. And of course, that's what we do here at CIIS. So I think we're invested in that. Here's another question from the audience. How can we uplift and amplify the voices of Indigenous people and cultures who have worked with fungi for hundreds, if not thousands of years?
I spent some time thinking about the subject of ethnobotany, and ethnobotany is an interesting subject, a troubled subject arising out of colonial expansion and settler interaction with indigenous knowledge systems. But it's an interesting subject in the history of science, because ethnobotanists study not plants, not people, not plants as botanists do, not people as anthropologists do, but the relationships between plants and people. And so much of the knowledge in the modern biological sciences comes from indigenous knowledge holders. Many of the great herbals written in Europe a lot of this is women's knowledge from wise women, from herb wives and midwives. This is a story which repeats itself, that lots of knowledge of plants that were brought back triumphantly by Western explorers from the New World were not discovered by those Western explorers. They might have been found in a market, or some indigenous informant would have revealed, often in environments of trust, certain pieces of their knowledge. So these relationships between people and plants and people and fungi and people and animal, the ethnozoology, the ethnomycology, the ethnobotany, these are so deeply so deeply tangled and troubled. But I think it's really the key thing for me is that so much of what we know about these organisms, so much of standing bodies of knowledge has been passed down from someone to someone to someone. This knowledge has been exchanged so often rather than discovered. And so when we're talking about amplifying the indigenous knowledges surrounding fungi, I think first step is listening. I work with the Fungi Foundation, who have got an amazing project where they are gathering ancestral uses of fungi. And a lot of this is going around and listening, finding people who want to talk and listening, asking people, and inquiring, taking the time. So there's this rather extraordinary collection of ancestral uses of fungi which they're building. They're being very, very careful about, of course, because this is an archive that many rapacious companies would want to exploit to mine the IP, and so it's not a straightforward process whatsoever. But so amplifying, I would say, listening is a big part, but then and then finding points of contact. I'm working with Juliana at the Fungi Foundation and an organization, some environmental rights lawyers at NYU, and the Sariaku people in Ecuador, and we're thinking together about different ways that mycology and the Sariaku cosmology can help support each other at this time, can help support each other at a time of extraordinary struggle to preserve these Sariaku ways of knowing and the lands and the rights to these lands. And we're just feeling this out, and we're not quite sure where it will go, but it feels like there are points of contact that we can find by listening to each other, by talking with each other, by exploring, by being in these forests together. So not a clear answer, but
yeah, really challenging to attend to the power imbalances and histories that have shaped so much of the scientific endeavor, right? And work to address those in right relations. It's great to hear about that partnership. Here's another question from the audience. How are the dynamics of mycelial communication affected by morphogenetic or other types of fields, morphogenetic, magnetic, psychic, and so forth?
A big question. So it's interesting that actually that Alexander Gurvich, the biologist who coined the term morphogenetic field as a way to describe the form, what he thought of as form-giving fields. So that you, how does an organism acquire their form? And the idea of that this is shaped by some kind of field principle, a form-giving field, was an idea that Gurvich came up with when he was looking at mushrooms. He was looking at mushrooms under the microscope, and he saw because mushrooms are made up of these same tubular types of cell that fungal networks are. They kind of felt together to create these highly organized structures. But what puzzled Gurvich is that he looked at the tissues of a mushroom, and he found that in animals, order arrives from prior order. So at the very earliest moment, an embryo divides and it has poles, it divides bilaterally, and all sorts of fundamental axes arise, and those axes pattern subsequent development, and subsequent development is patterned again by the subsequent axes, and so forth. So order arises from order, but in fungi, you have this, what Gurvich described as a disorder, these mycelial networks, which didn't have some kind of guiding shape. It's like, what shape is water? It depends where it's growing. It depends, depends where it's flowing. Depends where it's contained. It's a bit like that with fungal networks. And so he's like, how could you go from this disordered state to a highly ordered state? It's doing it the wrong way around. And so that, he's like, there must be some kind of guiding formal principle that he called morphogenetic fields. So that's just a historical aside. But if there are morphogenetic fields guiding the form, the coming into being of form in any life form, then they'll be applied. they'll apply to fungi as much as they apply to any other organism, even if fungi navigate their forms in different kinds of ways and have different kinds of ways of playing with form and different kinds of constraints with regard to form. Fungi are susceptible to all sorts of other fields, gravity, electrical fields, very interestingly, and this is an under-researched, like many aspects of fungi, under-researched area. I'm doing some work on this with my team in Amsterdam, and there are other people looking at this as well, where we are. It seems that all life forms to some degree are electrically excitable or sensitive to fluctuations in electrical fields, and can use these electrical fields and fluctuations in electrical fields to organize themselves and to transmit information. We're used to this idea with our neurons, which do this very fast and very precisely. But almost all cells to some degree modulate potential difference across their membranes. And so fungi do this. They're sensitive to electric fields. They seem to use fluctuations in electric fields to guide their growth and development and behaviors. And that's a whole very exciting part of fungal sciences. Other fields, light, electric magnetic fields, for sure. They're living beings in nested within all sorts of overlapping fields like we are.
Nice. And to follow up, is there any evidence that fungi use electrical fields or impulses to convey their information around themselves?
Yes. That's my favorite paper on the subject is from 1996 or 7, I can't remember, by a guy called Stefan Allson, who's a Swedish biologist, and he at the time was working at Lund, and he was trying to work out, he's studying these types of fungi that range over a long distance. They're wood-rotting fungi that have elaborate foraging behaviors. Some mycelial networks just spend all their time, they could live on a speck of house dust and not really range further than that. These fungi range quite far and have, their behavior is interesting. And he was trying to work out how they could transmit information so fast as they did. The person studying the next door lab was a neuroscientist studying moth brains, and they had a rig with microelectrodes they stuck into moth brains to study the patterns of electrical activity in moth detections of pheromones. So he thought, well, hang on a sec, could I borrow these electrodes and stick them into my fungal networks and see what happens? And he did this, and he found that there did seem to be regular waves of depolarization analogous to the action potentials, the impulses that travel in our nerve cells. There are certain differences, but broadly an analogous type of phenomenon. And he found that these rhythmic impulses changed if you put a block of wood on the fungal network. That the wood is a very salient stimulus to this fungus because it's their food. That's everything's oriented towards different types of wood. And if you put a block of plastic on the fungal network, then the fungus didn't respond. If you put a block of wood on the fungus, then these impulses, the rate of firing increased, and then it decreased when you took off the block of wood. It's a great study, and it has been shockingly under-researched since then, and thankfully people are starting to look into this again. But so there is evidence. It's sparse evidence because it's been sparsely investigated.
So that seems to then point us to this next question. A theme throughout has been how much we don't know, how much there is to be discovered. And somebody asks, how do you become a mycologist?
This is really a good question, and it's not always straightforward. We're talking about the kingdom of life here, right? It would be so strange if we were having this conversation about animals or plants. Imagine that would be sickeningly general. You'd be like, why would you? What would we? How would we even conceive of such an event? So it's kind of absurd that we're sitting here just talking about a whole kingdom of life, as if it was in such general terms. So there are so many ways to study fungi. You could study fungi in terms of pathology. You could be a medical practitioner studying fungal diseases. You could be a plant pathologist studying fungal diseases of crops. You could be a material scientist studying how you can form different kinds of fabrication materials using fungi. You could be an ecologist thinking about how organisms relate to each other outside and how fungi play a part in those webs of relation. You could be a crop scientist trying to work out how to help plants survive in more extreme conditions. You could be a bacteriologist thinking about the organisms that the bacteria depend on to survive. You could be any number of different disciplines engaging with fungi. So although you don't tend to find departments of mycology, and I think that's actually, I don't think it would make sense to start departments of mycology really, because the fungi are always in relation with other organisms, and so it would be unnecessarily contained, I think. But so it depends on who you are and what you like to do. What kind of inquiry do you like? Are you more scientific? Are you less scientific? Do you like being outside? Do you like being in labs? Do you like building things? Do you like solving problems? Like, there's so many different ways. So I would start from that, and then find a way into the fungal sciences or the fungal inquiries. Not because they don't just have to be sciences. That way, and yeah, because it's not a straightforward route.
Sounds like it's always interdisciplinary, always in relation to other fields.
Oh, but I should say also that just a good way to begin an interest in fungi is to spend time looking for them, spend time looking for mushrooms outside, spend time growing mushrooms in your home, spend time with them, spend time observing them, and start with personal experience. Or gardening, whenever you're gardening, you're cultivating fungal relationships. So yeah, I start with experience and see where that leads, is what I would say.
And I wonder if that experience might convey some information, perhaps from the fungi to the person, which sort of relates to another question. Are there studies that are seeking to determine if there are any ties to the fungi communication informational network and a quantum informational entanglement as an informational conduit? Wait, let me read that again. Are there studies that are seeking to determine if there are any ties to the fungi communication informational network and a quantum informational entanglement as an informational conduit?
Not that I know of. It's a short answer. Quantum biology is a fascinating collection of perspectives and disciplines. And there's been work with plants and light harvesting in light harvesting complexes during photosynthesis, where there are certain quantum phenomena about how electrons distribute themselves in these wild constructions that plants make. I don't know of anyone doing this work or analogous work with fungi, although that doesn't mean it's not happening.
It sounds fascinating. Relatedly, another attendee asks, what thinkers can you recommend who are doing similar work as you?
I mean, there's so many thinkers who I find fascinating that aren't necessarily doing similar work to me, but that I find inspiring and helpful. Maybe I'll suggest some of those names. So Ian McGilchrist is a philosopher and a psychologist and a very general scholar whose recent work, The Matter with Things, is something I find very, very helpful. Michael Levin is a biologist working with the different ways that bioelectrical activity can guide development and behaviors, and is really helping to expand our ideas of what's possible in biological systems. So I would suggest him as well. Then there's Lynn Margulis is a wonder. She's no longer around, but she did all sorts of very extraordinary work with thinking about the symbiotic way of life and how fundamental symbiosis has been to the whole history of life. And I draw on her work a lot. Donna Haraway as well, a Whiteheadian, a relational thinker, a process relational thinker, wildly original, funny. Yeah, there's just a four.
That's great. Yeah, and your book has an amazing bibliography. I was quite fascinated by that. So I would think that there are many great sources there as well. Thanks. Let's see. Another question is, what's the most surprising thing you've come across during your research?
Crikey. What's the most surprising thing? Well, there was a moment. So there's so many surprising things. It happens all the time. One of the ways I'm surprised these days is when just looking at the flows within these mycorrhizal fungal networks with my collaborators Toby Kears and Tom Shimizu in Amsterdam, in incredible labs that they run there, and I'm always surprised. We spend time just looking at these flows within the networks. Like, stop, play it again, go back. What's it doing? Whoa, it's just a wildly surprising time. It's wildly exciting and wildly surprising, and it always feels like you're seeing something new. And so that's a kind of ambient, ongoing surprise, which I think characterizes so much of fungal inquiry. There have been other times where I've been surprised to see. I was studying a type of plants that depend on. Their seeds are very tiny, and the seeds won't germinate until a fungus has grown into the seed. It's a kind of a sperm meets egg moment. And I found under the microscope an example of a fungus growing into a seed, and the seed just beginning to germinate. And it was like you could see this very first moment of contact giving rise to this new body, to this new life. And that was surprising, just because it's something I knew about in principle, but I hadn't actually just seen it before. And when you see it, it's different. And so I was surprised there. But I really could talk about this all day. There are so many surprising things.
It seems like field biology is going to be constantly surprising too, just being out there. Great. Another question is, how are mycelium networks being affected by climate change? How are they adapting?
Big question. Again, lots of ways to be a fungus. It's the kingdom of life. So there are some fungi which are, as their plant partner, they might depend on a certain type of plant. As those plants are, struggle to adapt to a changing environment, struggle to migrate because of different ways that we've chopped up continents. Those fungi might have fewer and fewer places to live, and they might be really struggling. There are other fungi which might be trafficked around the world by humans, piggybacking on global networks of trade. And those might be thriving, constantly new opportunities to find yourself in, and new situations to explore, new problems to cause. And there might be fungi who are adapting. So there's a worrying rise of fungal pathogens of humans, and humans, because we're mammals in general, we're slightly warm, well, actually quite warm, and so it makes it difficult for some fungi to live in and on us. But as the environment warms up, it seems, although it's not for sure, it seems that fungi are adapting to higher temperatures and then finding it easier to make their way into mammalian bodies, including humans. So that's another way that this might happen in a slightly more scarily. There are all sorts of range expansions. So like there might be a forest that's been killed by some climate-related factor, and all this dead wood, a fungus comes in, all this food to eat, that fungus might thrive. Yeah, there are all sorts of ways.
Yeah, here in the US, there was an outbreak of fungal lung disease in the Midwest a month ago or so, and which was, I think, surprising. It was something that doesn't normally have an outbreak, and there was speculations about causes, but also speculations maybe that people had compromised immune systems if they'd had COVID. So like complex interactions here between fungi and humans. Another participant asks, if you were a fungus, which one would you be?
I find it so hard to answer this kind of question, but some depends on my mood. Like sometimes I'd want to be a decomposing, a wood rotting fungus, you know, just to have that hunger for such a recalcitrant material that required this like extraordinary enzymatic ingenuity to break down and to spend time in these like totally wildly busy places as all these organisms come in and doing different things, you know, each enabling the others, and also like a very intense party. Sometimes I'd really want to be, I think overall, if I had to choose one way of being, it would be a mycorrhizal, well, it's a particular type of mycorrhizal fungus, because I just would really like to experience this kind of relationship with organisms that do such different things. And on whom I would depend entirely, and would like to feel that relationality. And so, yeah, I think probably a mycorrhizal fungus of some sort, on balance.
Very cool. And the final question we have from our audience today, which I saved to the end, is how do we as humans live in a better relationship with fungi?
Yes, so I think I work with an amazing mycologist called Juliana Furci, and she's really been pioneering fungal conservation. And there's so many ways that, you know, like fungi are being missed out, excluded, marginalized in so many of our disciplines and processes. And in conservation, it's similar. You know, fungi don't have adequate protections. They often aren't included in litanies of conservation. They're woefully underrepresented, and so I think one of the ways is to start building them into our conservation frameworks, building them into very importantly, building them into school curricula, into undergraduate courses, unlocking new funds for fungal research, all sorts of ways that we can, and also just all the way down to the ecological societies, you know, fungal forays, creating a culture of learning, of excitement, of just interest, of taking the time to pay attention to fungi. And there's so many ways this happens at a grassroots level. It's a wildly exciting place. You know, the grassroots fungal inquiry is a we haven't talked about it enough, but it's a big part of fungal inquiry, because all too often there have been no other ways to explore a fungal interest. And so the amateur fascination with fungi, amateur, the true sense of the word, you know, from the Latin, I love. This is in no means a diminishment, in fact, quite the opposite. So, so I think we can, anything that invites us to turn our attention, turn our interest towards these organisms, to let them affect us, to let ourselves be distracted by them. You know, I think this can lead us into more generative and fulsome relationships with this kingdom of life.
Wonderful. What a beautiful spot to end on, trying to develop our relationships with this whole kingdom of life that so many of us don't know very much about, but it's all around us. And you point out that we can relatively easily become more knowledgeable through gardening, or through spending time in nature, or maybe joining a foraging group to learn more about the fungus among us. I'm sure you've never heard that before. I really thank you for bringing up all these really creative ideas about incorporating imagination and biology together. Your point, symbiosis is not an option, is definitely going to stick with me. And this emphasis on relationality between human lives and this whole kingdom of fungus. So thank you so much for taking this time with us today.
Thanks for having me.